Engine Performance 1 Test 15. Which term is used to describe how easily a fuel evaporates? Which term is used to describe how easily actually that's going to be volatility. Volatility, yeah. As far as your octane goes, you know, when the higher the octane level, I mean, the higher the octane on a fuel, the slower it burns. If you use high octane fuel in a vehicle that's not, or engine that's not designed to use high octane fuel, it makes a mess in there. It doesn't burn all of it, and it leaves unburned fuel in there on the cylinder walls, and that turns into carbon, and it starts to build up, and after a while you had a caked up carbony mess because you figured premium fuel was cleaner. And that's really not good. As a matter of fact, there's technical service bulletins that they issued years ago from Chrysler and Ford that said don't use 93 octane in a vehicle that says it's supposed to have 87 in it. Technician A says winter blended gasoline is intended to vaporize at lower temperatures than summer blend. Technician B says summer blended gasoline is intended to vaporize at lower temperatures than winter blend. So what you got? If there's winter blended, think about what it is. Winter blended gasoline, you're expecting to have lower temperatures, and the whole deal for gasoline, if you're going to have perfect combustion, is it's got to be vaporized, right?
So Technician A.
Yeah, that's going to be Technician A. And so which term describes the pressure of the vapor above the fuel when the fuel is at 100 degrees? Read vapor pressure. We actually used to have a little kit for testing that, and it was really pretty cool. What we would do is we would have something, they had a coffee cup, and you'd have to put water in there that was at something like 160 degrees, and then you would get some fuel and put it in this little closed canister, and you'd have a little pressure gauge on the top of this closed canister, and you'd have your thermometer in your little coffee cup of fuel. And as I remember, when the thermometer got down to a certain, you put it in there at 160, it got down to a certain temperature. That means that the gas had heated up to hot enough to where you could trust the read vapor pressure. And we'd have to check that when we were doing drivability work. Ford sent us a little kit to do that, and also to check see if there's water in the fuel. And they had the thing about checking to see if there's alcohol in there and how much alcohol is in it. Technician A says vapor lock. Basically, that's read vapor pressure. That first one, that third one. Technician A says vapor lock is a rich condition. Technician B says vapor lock is a lean condition. You ever heard of vapor lock? You know what that is? We used to see that on cars in the hot summertime if they had a metal fuel line that was running fairly close to a exhaust manifold. And what that means is the fuel is boiling in the line. And if the fuel is boiling in the line, occasionally when your injectors are wanting solid fuel sprayed through them, they're getting air bubbles. That ain't good, right? There was a Crown Victoria. No, I'm not a Crown Victoria. It was a Lincoln. Was it a Continental? Well, let's see, it was too. It was a 95 Continental, and it had a sideways V8 in it. And the firing order on that thing was 137265548. And I had my power balance screen up on that worldwide diagnostic system, and it was idling a little rough. That was what it was in there for. And I noticed that when it was going through this rough idle stuff, it would drop the cylinders. It would drop number 1, and then it would quit dropping 1, then it would drop 3, and it dropped them in the order of the firing order. When it was acting up, it would drop the cylinders in order of the firing order. And I scratched my head about that a little bit, and then I got a hold of the hotline, and they were scratching their head about it. And they said, my goodness, that's maybe a cam sensor or something. I don't know, what's up with that? Because I said, you can watch it. I actually showed it to him, And he says, I don't know. And so I says, this is a returnless fuel system. And I noticed that my fuel pressure, you could read the fuel pressure with a service bay diagnostic system with with a transducer hooked into the fuel rail. But I hooked a regular gauge up to it, and I noticed it was bouncing. And I said, that looks like there's air in the fuel. So when I pushed the little trigger on that thing, like where you're going to relieve the pressure, and some air come out of that thing, and then we wound up with solid fuel in there, and it was running smooth. And if you let it run long enough, it'd start doing that again. And I told Dennis, the guy that owned the car, he's the dispatcher, I said, this thing's got to have a fuel pump because it's cavitating and it's putting air bubbles in the fuel rail. And so when we put a fuel pump in there, the problem went away. Well, that car had been traded in because it had a rough idle that the owner didn't like, and the Lincoln Mercury place couldn't figure out why it was idling rough. so they kind of gave up on it. But I think I just kind of got lucky, you know, I just sort of got to thinking the right way when I was troubleshooting it. Which of the following symptoms may be the result of using winter blend gasoline in warm weather? Rough idle. And let me tell you something else. And I may have talked about this before, but if you put winter blend, or I mean, I'm sorry, if you put, which is like putting that, the premium gas in a one that's made to burn regular gas, it can make it pop and snort and cut out and die whenever it's winter. I mean, whenever it's cold.
What was number 4?
Number 4 was technician B. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Never mind.
Vapor loxoline condition. Basically, you're going to have air. So if you've got too much air and not enough fuel, you know, if there's air in the fuel, you're going to have, you know, that. All right. So let me see. So rough idle is going to be what you're going to have in that used in winter blended gasoline in warm weather. When would you have a problem like that? What if somebody bought a tank of gas during the coldest part of the winter, and then they had to go in the hospital for some kind of a operation or something, and they didn't come out of the hospital until, you know, several months went by, or they didn't drive that vehicle for whatever reason, and now all of a sudden when they crank it up, it's running kind of sorry, and so they bring it over there to you and they say, hey, this thing runs terrible, and I don't know what the problem is, whether it was running fine when I parked it. And you say, well, when did you park it? And they say, well, I parked it, you know, last December. And then they say, and now you look at your, you know, date on your watch and it's already June and it's warm. And it's been sitting there 6 months. And so the first thing you need to do is not go in there and replace a bunch of parts. The first thing you want to do is see what kind of quality of fuel we have. Did he buy this in the winter? And what I would tell the guy is if you parked it last winter and you hadn't started it until just now, I would drive this tank of gas out of it and put some more gas in it and see how it runs. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes that's the best advice you can give somebody. Just drive this tank of gas out of it and see how, if it still runs bad, we'll have a look at it. But let's don't spend any money on it yet. I'm going to tell you they'll appreciate that. But if you say, well, we're going to put plugs, we're going to put wires, we're going to clean your fuel injectors, we're going to and it still runs bad, they say, that guy charged me $600, and so on and so forth, you know. All right. What should be added to the fuel in a vehicle that's to be stored for a long period of time?
Fuel stable.
Yeah, like stable or whatever, stabil or whatever, that's good stuff. Which term describes the anti-knock property of fuel? Anti-knock, meaning you know, like, have you ever heard labor knock? Like when you're pulling a hill, you hear this sound like marbles rattling around the engine, like, you know. That's basically, some people call it valve rattle. You ever heard that? They call it valve rattle. It ain't got nothing to do with the valves. It's got everything to do with the fuel lighting off before the piston gets to the top. You know, I mean, before top dead center is when it's supposed to fire, but if it's too far before top dead center, the flame front will meet the piston on its way up, and it'll try to stop it. And that causes it sounds like hitting the piston with a hammer, you know, like drumming on it with drumsticks or something. But anyway, so what you do is you, and sometimes, let me tell you something else, that labor knock will be caused sometimes by carbon buildup on the cylinder head. If the carbon builds up on the cylinder head enough to where it raises the compression, it'll cause ping and labor knock and all that kind of stuff too.
I'm going to go with phase separation.
Yeah, no, that's actually going to be octane, believe it or not. What people will do when they got one is doing that kind of stuff is they'll put a higher octane gas in it, and it makes it less likely to ping. But the problem is if you're running higher octane gas and it's causing carbon buildup, it'll actually get to the point where you have to run 93 octane all the time so it won't ping. So you're building, you know, and this is not, there's a sliding scale on this. It's not going to happen on every vehicle, but it will happen on a lot of them. And, you know, that's why those bulletins came out from the manufacturers, you know, back, heck, it was a long time ago, probably 15, 16 years ago. All the following terms describe engine knock except A, spark knock, B, ping, C, detonation, and the answer is D. All of these describe engine knock. Detonation is whenever the engine gets hot. Have you ever drove a motor that was overheating really bad? You hear it sound like it rattling and all that. That's detonation. That's what that is. That's actually it's so hot that the heat's causing the gas to light off before the spark does. And that's really bad. And, you know, the flash point of the cylinder is reached. Then spark knock is whenever the timing is too fast. If you pull the timing around fast enough and the spark happens too soon, it's going to cause it to, you know, light off whenever the piston ain't ready for it to, and it'll run into that flame front when it's coming down. Ping is basically the, what do they call a word that sounds like what you're talking about? Onomatopoeia or something like that. Like if you got a word that's boom, it sounds like a ping. Or my dad used to say they call a board a plank because that's the sound it makes when it hits the ground. Clank, I don't know where he came up with that, but that's what my dad thinks. Okay, which of these is one of the first additives to prevent engine knock? Now, if you hadn't read your book, you're not going to know that, but it's TEL, TEL. Now, talking about gas, back in, I know about how long ago this was because my son Matt is 30 years old now, and he was a little over a year old at the time. And I had him and my daughter in this little Volkswagen I was driving, and I was cut around behind Texaco Research, and I was going back down that, Port Arthur, Texas, where they make all the gasoline and everything. And I had 50 or 60 bucks in my pocket. I went right by a gas station. I don't know why I didn't stop and buy gas, but I was a dummy. I just had other things on my mind. And I ran that darn thing out of gas. And I said, I knew better than that. I had gas in it. So I said, well, I had a can with me, and so I told Kelly, I said, stay in the car and look after Matt, because I wasn't going to walk very far. There was a building over here that had a door on it. And I just went over and knocked on that door. Boom, boom, boom. And so this guy came to the door wearing a lab coat, and a pair of glasses down on his nose and all that. He looked like a mad scientist. And I said, I ran out of gas out here, and I got a can. I need to see about getting somebody to take me to get some gas or something if it's okay. And he says, hold on just a minute. And so he went back into his lab, and he came out with this big glass bottle that had a huge cork in the top of it. And on the outside of the bottle it said toluene. He says, pour that in there, it'll run off that. Well, now this guy's at Texaco Research, he knows what he's talking about. I said, okay, and it was about a quart, but the gas station wasn't very far. And so I poured that stuff in that Volkswagen, and boom, it fired up, and I drove it back down there right quick and filled it up, and it ran better when it had that stuff in it than it did ever ran with gasoline in it. But that was just one of the little experiences I had, when I was, stumbled across. But whenever some guy in a white lab coat hands you something in a bottle that says something on it, and if he's working on making gas, you got to feel like he knows what it'll run off of. If a gasoline has the same anti-knock characteristics as isooctane, what is the octane of the fuel? 100. 100. If it has the same anti-knock characteristics, that means it burns really slow, okay? That's what that means. Okay, that is the terminus of Engine Performance 1 Test 15. And we'll move on to our next test.